Look around you right now. Everything you see, from the device in your hands to the walls that surround you, represents the tiniest fraction of human existence. Your entire world, every city, every monument, every piece of technology that defines modern life, all of it emerged in just the last few thousand years. But humans have been walking this planet for nearly 300,000 years, which means for over 90,000 years, roughly 300 generations of your ancestors, we lived in a world that would be completely unrecognizable to you today. What were they doing all that time? How did they survive? What did their daily lives actually look like? The answer isn't what you think. Because the story you learnt in school, the neat progression from primitive cave dwellers to farmers to civilization, it's missing something crucial. It's missing the incredible sophistication, the complex societies, the remarkable achievements of people who left no written records behind. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these videos. So maybe hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing Berlin at breakfast time, Tokyo at midnight, all of us wondering about the same mysteries together. Tonight, we're going back, way back, to a time before pyramids, before agriculture, before the first cities ever rose from the earth. We're going to explore what humans really did during those 90,000 years that history books barely mention. And what we're going to discover is that our ancestors weren't just surviving, they were thriving, creating, innovating, and building complex societies that would make you question everything you thought you knew about human progress. Picture this. It's 50,000 years ago. Your ancestor wakes up not in a dark cave, but in a carefully constructed shelter made from mammoth bones and stretched hides. The floor is paved with flat stones, arranged in intricate patterns. Storage pits line the walls, filled with preserved foods that will last through the harsh winter months. Outside, smoke rises from multiple fire hearths, each one serving a different purpose. One for cooking, another for tool-making, a third for a mysterious ritual that archaeologists still don't fully understand. This isn't a temporary camp. This is a permanent settlement, home to perhaps 200 people who have lived here for generations. They know every animal migration route within 100 miles. They've mapped the locations of the best stone for tools, the richest plant foods, the most reliable water sources. They have trade relationships with groups living 500 miles away, exchanging exotic shells, rare minerals, and finished goods along networks that span entire continents. But here's what's really remarkable. These people aren't just surviving day to day. They're planning decades into the future. They're managing complex social relationships. They're creating art that rivals anything produced in the modern world. They're developing technologies so sophisticated that archaeologists are still trying to figure out how they worked. This is the hidden story of humanity. The 90,000 years that came before everything you've been taught about human history. And it's a story that changes everything about how we understand ourselves as a species. Most people think human progress looks like a straight line. Stone tools, then bronze tools, then iron tools, then eventually computers and smartphones. But the real story is far more complex, far more interesting, and in many ways, far more impressive. Because for the vast majority of human existence, we weren't building towards civilization. We were civilization, just a completely different kind than what came after. Let's start with what archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. This happened around 40,000 years ago, and it represents one of the most dramatic transformations in human history. Almost overnight, in evolutionary terms, human culture exploded into complexity. Art appeared, music emerged, tool technology became incredibly sophisticated. Trade networks expanded across vast distances, and social organization reached levels that wouldn't be seen again until the rise of agricultural societies thousands of years later. But here's what's fascinating. This revolution didn't happen because humans suddenly got smarter. Our brains have been the same size for over 100,000 years. Something else changed, something that unlocked capabilities that had been lying dormant in human consciousness for millennia. The key was language. Not simple communication, which humans had possessed for hundreds of thousands of years, but true symbolic language. The ability to use words to represent abstract concepts, to discuss things that weren't physically present, to share complex ideas across generations. Once this cognitive breakthrough occurred, everything changed. Imagine being able to plan hunting strategies weeks in advance, discussing the behavior patterns of animals that won't migrate through your territory for months. Picture describing the location of a valuable resource to someone who's never seen it, using only words and gestures. Think about the ability to teach complex skills to children who won't need those skills for years, ensuring that crucial knowledge survives even when the experts die. This is what separated your ancestors from every other species on the planet. Not just intelligence, but the ability to share intelligence, to build upon it, to create a collective knowledge base that grew more sophisticated with each passing generation. And grow it did. By 30,000 years ago, humans had developed technologies that seem almost magical when you consider the tools they had to work with. They created spear throwers that could launch projectiles with deadly accuracy at distances of over 100 yards. They built sophisticated traps that could capture entire herds of animals without human intervention. They developed methods for preserving food that kept meat fresh for months, allowing them to survive in environments where no other large mammal could thrive. But perhaps most impressively, they mastered their environments so completely that they could live comfortably in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. During the last ice age, when glaciers covered much of northern Europe and temperatures were 15 degrees colder than today, humans not only survived but flourished. They built elaborate settlements, created stunning works of art, and maintained trade networks that connected communities across thousands of miles of frozen landscape. These weren't desperate people barely clinging to existence. These were sophisticated societies with rich cultural traditions, complex belief systems, and technological capabilities that wouldn't be matched again for thousands of years. Take the famous cave paintings at Largo in France, created around 17,000 years ago. These aren't crude stick figures scratched on rock walls. They're masterpieces of artistic technique, showing sophisticated understanding of perspective, shading, and composition. The artists used complex pigment preparations, created scaffolding to reach high walls, and developed techniques for creating the illusion of movement that wouldn't be rediscovered until the invention of animation. But the paintings tell us something even more remarkable about the people who created them. They show animals that lived hundreds of miles away, species that the local population would never have seen in their daily lives. This means the artists were either travelling enormous distances to observe these animals, or they were part of information networks so sophisticated that detailed knowledge of distant ecosystems was regularly shared between far-flung communities. The evidence suggests both were true. Archaeological finds show that Upper Paleolithic humans were incredibly mobile, following complex seasonal migration patterns that could cover thousands of miles annually. But they were also part of vast trade and information networks that connected groups across entire continents. Think about what this means. These people weren't isolated bands struggling to survive in a hostile wilderness. They were part of interconnected societies that shared knowledge, resources, and culture across distances that would challenge modern transportation systems. They knew what was happening hundreds of miles away. They planned coordinated activities across multiple communities. They maintained relationships and obligations that spanned generations. This level of social complexity required something we rarely associate with prehistoric humans: bureaucracy. Not the mind-numbing paperwork kind, but sophisticated systems for tracking relationships, obligations, and resources across vast networks of people who might never meet face to face. Your ancestors developed intricate gift exchange systems that could maintain alliances across thousands of miles. A shell necklace made on the shores of the Black Sea might end up buried with a hunter in what is now Germany, having passed through dozens of hands along the way. Each exchange strengthened social bonds, shared information about distant territories, and created webs of mutual obligation that kept peace between groups who competed for the same resources. These weren't simple trades. They were complex social contracts that required sophisticated understanding of reciprocity, delayed gratification, and abstract value. A group might give away their best furs today, knowing that the favor would be returned years later when they needed access to distant hunting grounds or faced a particularly harsh winter. But perhaps the most remarkable achievement of these ancient societies was their approach to risk management. Living without agriculture, without permanent food stores, without the safety nets that we take for granted, they developed strategies for survival that were incredibly sophisticated. They didn't just hunt whatever was available. They managed entire ecosystems, using controlled burning to shape grasslands, creating artificial clearings that attracted game animals, and even practicing a form of wildlife management that kept prey populations stable over generations. Archaeological evidence shows that some communities maintained these practices for thousands of years, passing down ecological knowledge that was more detailed and accurate than many modern conservation programs. They also developed elaborate social insurance systems. When one group faced hardship, others would share resources, knowing that the favor would be returned when fortune reversed. These mutual aid networks extended across enormous distances, creating a safety net that allowed human populations to survive catastrophes that would have wiped out any other species. Consider the Younger Dryas period, a climatic catastrophe that struck around 12,800 years ago. Global temperatures plummeted, turning vast areas of forest into tundra almost overnight. Many species went extinct, but humans not only survived, they adapted so quickly that within a few generations they were thriving in the new environment. How did they do it? Through the accumulated wisdom of hundreds of generations, encoded not in books or digital files, but in stories, songs, and rituals that preserved crucial survival information across millennia. Every tale told around the fire contained practical knowledge disguised as entertainment. Stories about heroic journeys described actual travel routes and the resources available along the way. Myths about supernatural beings encoded information about animal behavior and seasonal changes. Songs preserved the locations of water sources, the properties of medicinal plants, and the techniques for making essential tools. This oral tradition wasn't primitive. It was incredibly sophisticated, capable of preserving complex technical information with remarkable accuracy across thousands of years. When anthropologists study modern hunter-gatherer societies, they find that traditional stories often contain precise details about historical events, geographical features, and ecological relationships that can be verified through archaeological and scientific research. Your ancestors lived in a world where information was power, and the most successful groups were those that could gather, process and share knowledge most effectively. They developed human intelligence networks that would impress modern intelligence agencies. Scouts ranged hundreds of miles ahead of main groups, returning with detailed reports about resources, weather patterns, and the movements of other human populations. They created standardized systems for sharing this information. Archaeological evidence shows that similar symbolic systems appear across vast distances, suggesting that different groups had developed common languages for communicating complex ideas. Stone markers, carved symbols, and even arrangements of natural objects served as message systems that could convey detailed information to people who might arrive months later. But intelligence gathering was just the beginning. These societies also developed sophisticated decision-making processes that allowed large groups to coordinate their activities without centralized authority. They held councils that could involve representatives from dozens of different communities, making collective decisions about hunting territories, trade routes, and responses to environmental changes. These weren't chaotic free-for-alls. Archaeological evidence suggests they had formal protocols for debate, methods for reaching consensus, and systems for ensuring that agreements were honored across time and distance. They developed what anthropologists call heterarchy, flexible leadership systems where different individuals could take charge depending on the situation and their particular expertise. During hunting seasons, the best hunters led. When the group needed to relocate, those with the most geographical knowledge took charge. In times of social conflict, individuals with diplomatic skills assumed leadership roles. This created resilient societies that could adapt to changing circumstances without the rigid hierarchies that would later characterize agricultural civilizations. The sophistication of these social systems is revealed in their material culture. Tools weren't just functional objects. They were works of art, status symbols, and carriers of cultural meaning. A single spear point might take weeks to create, involving not just technical skill, but aesthetic judgment and cultural knowledge about appropriate designs for different social contexts. The most skilled craftspeople held positions of enormous prestige. Their workshops served as centers of learning where knowledge was passed down through apprenticeship systems that could span decades. Master toolmakers didn't just teach techniques. They transmitted entire worldviews about the relationship between humans, materials, and the forces of nature. These workshops were also centers of innovation. Despite what popular images suggest, Stone Age technology wasn't static. New techniques were constantly being developed, tested, and refined. Tool designs evolved rapidly, with improvements spreading across continents in surprisingly short periods. The bow and arrow, for instance, appears to have been invented multiple times in different parts of the world, but once the technology was perfected, it spread through existing trade networks with remarkable speed. Within a few thousand years, nearly every human society on Earth had adopted this revolutionary hunting technology. Technology! This rapid spread of innovation reveals something crucial about prehistoric human societies. They weren't isolated pockets of humanity struggling independently. They were part of a vast, interconnected web of knowledge sharing that spanned the entire globe. Ideas, techniques, and technologies flowed along the same routes as trade goods, creating a kind of prehistoric internet of human knowledge. But unlike our modern information networks, this ancient system was built on face-to-face relationships and tested through generations of practical use. When a new hunting technique was developed in what is now Siberia, it didn't just spread because someone posted it online. It spread because it worked, because it saved lives, because communities that adopted it gained real advantages over those that didn't. This created an evolutionary pressure for innovation that was incredibly powerful. Your ancestors lived in a world where a single technological breakthrough could mean the difference between prosperity and starvation, between expansion and extinction. The groups that were best at generating, adopting, and improving new ideas were the ones that thrived and passed their knowledge on to future generations. The evidence for this constant innovation is everywhere once you know how to look for it. Stone tool assemblages show rapid changes in design and manufacturing techniques. Bone and antler artifacts reveal increasingly sophisticated understanding of material properties. Even simple things like fire-making tools show continuous refinement over thousands of years. But perhaps the most impressive innovations were in the realm of what we might call biotechnology. Your ancestors didn't just hunt wild animals. They developed sophisticated techniques for managing and even domesticating various species long before the agricultural revolution. They created artificial environments that attracted specific animals. In some regions, they built elaborate fish weirs that could channel entire salmon runs into carefully constructed traps. In others, they developed techniques for managing reindeer herds that bordered on true domestication, allowing human communities to follow the animals on their seasonal migrations while gradually influencing their breeding patterns. Even more remarkably, they developed forms of plant management that were far more sophisticated than simple gathering. They transplanted useful species to new locations, modified landscapes to encourage the growth of important food plants, and even practiced selective harvesting techniques that improved the quality and quantity of wild crops over time. Some archaeologists argue that what we call the Neolithic Revolution, the transition to agriculture, wasn't really a revolution at all. It was simply the final step in a process of landscape and species management that had been going on for tens of thousands of years. Your ancestors weren't primitive foragers who suddenly discovered farming. They were sophisticated ecosystem engineers who gradually intensified their management practices until they crossed the threshold into full agriculture. This perspective changes everything about how we understand human development. Instead of seeing agriculture as the beginning of human civilization, we might see it as the moment when human societies became so successful at managing their environments that they could afford to stay in one place permanently. But staying in one place came with costs that your mobile ancestors had avoided for thousands of years. Permanent settlements made populations vulnerable to disease epidemics, resource depletion, and social conflicts that nomadic groups could simply walk away from. The archaeological record shows that early agricultural societies often suffered from malnutrition, social inequality, and warfare in ways that their hunter-gatherer predecessors had not. Your nomadic ancestors had developed solutions to these problems that modern societies are only beginning to rediscover. They understood that mobility wasn't just about following food sources, it was a strategy for maintaining social health, environmental sustainability, and cultural vitality. When resources became scarce in one area, they moved to another. When social tensions arose within a group, individuals could join different communities. When ecosystems became stressed from human use, populations could shift to other regions, allowing damaged areas to recover. This created a kind of natural regulation that kept human societies in balance with their environments for thousands of years. They also developed sophisticated strategies for preventing the concentration of power and wealth that plagued later agricultural societies. In nomadic groups, accumulating material possessions was actually a disadvantage since everything had to be carried from place to place. Status came not from owning things, but from knowing things, from having skills, relationships, and knowledge that benefited the entire community. Leadership was fluid and situational. The person who led during a hunt might follow during a migration. The individual who made important decisions about food distribution might defer to others when it came to resolving social conflicts. This created societies that were remarkably egalitarian compared to what came later. Women held positions of enormous influence in these societies. Archaeological evidence suggests that they were often the keepers of crucial ecological knowledge, the specialists in plant foods and medicines that provided the foundation of nomadic survival strategies. They played central roles in trade networks, diplomatic relationships, and the transmission of cultural knowledge from one generation to the next. The toolkit of prehistoric women was incredibly sophisticated. They developed techniques for processing plant foods that could extract maximum nutrition from minimal resources. They created medicines from hundreds of different plants, with knowledge of dosages, preparation methods, and treatment protocols that rivaled modern pharmacology. They invented textile technologies that produced materials superior in many ways to modern synthetic fabrics. But perhaps most importantly, they were the architects of the social systems that held these complex societies together. The evidence suggests that many prehistoric cultures were organized around kinship networks that were traced through maternal lines. Women often served as the living libraries of genealogical knowledge that determined access to resources, marriage partners, and territorial rights. This wasn't simply because of biological factors. It was a practical response to the challenges of nomadic life. In societies where groups frequently split and reformed, where individuals might travel hundreds of miles to find marriage partners, where complex alliances had to be maintained across vast distances, someone had to keep track of all the relationships. Archaeological evidence suggests that women often served this crucial function. They were the keepers of the social maps that made cooperation possible on a continental scale. They remembered who was related to whom, who owed favors to whom, which groups could be trusted and which should be avoided. This knowledge was encoded in stories, songs, and rituals that women passed down to their daughters, creating an unbroken chain of social intelligence that stretched back thousands of years. The spiritual life of your ancestors was equally sophisticated. Far from the crude animism that popular accounts suggest, they developed complex belief systems that integrated practical knowledge with profound philosophical insights about the nature of reality, consciousness, and humanity's place in the cosmos. Their shamans weren't primitive witch doctors. They were highly trained specialists who served as psychologists, doctors, diplomats, and spiritual guides. They underwent years of rigorous training that included mastery of medicinal plants, psychological techniques, astronomical knowledge, and complex ritual procedures. Archaeological evidence reveals that some shamanic traditions maintained continuity for thousands of years, with sacred sites being used for the same purposes across dozens of generations. Cave paintings show that certain symbolic systems remained stable for millennia, suggesting that these weren't random superstitions but carefully preserved knowledge traditions. These spiritual practices served crucial practical functions. Shamanic journeying techniques, which involved altered states of consciousness, were often used for problem-solving, creative inspiration, and psychological healing. Ritual ceremonies served to strengthen social bonds, resolve conflicts, and mark important transitions in individual and community life. But they also reveal something remarkable about the intellectual sophistication of prehistoric humans. Your ancestors were asking the same fundamental questions that occupy philosophers and scientists today. What is the nature of consciousness? How are all living things connected? What responsibilities do humans have toward the natural world? Their answers, encoded in myth and ritual, often show startling parallels to insights emerging from modern quantum physics, ecology, and consciousness research. They understood that reality was far more complex and interconnected than it appears on the surface. They developed practices for accessing states of consciousness that revealed hidden aspects of existence, This wasn't primitive thinking. It was sophisticated inquiry into the deepest mysteries of existence, carried out by people who had the time and mental space to contemplate such questions because they had mastered the practical challenges of survival so completely. The more we learn about these ancient societies, the more we realize that the transition to agriculture and civilization wasn't progress in any simple sense. It was a trade-off. Your ancestors gave up mobility, egalitarianism, leisure time, and environmental harmony in exchange for larger populations, material accumulation, and technological complexity. Different societies made this trade-off at different times and in different ways. Some never made it at all, maintaining nomadic lifestyles right up to the present day. Others experimented with agriculture but returned to hunting and gathering when the cost became too high. The archaeological record shows that this transition was often traumatic. Skeletal remains from early agricultural societies show signs of malnutrition, disease, and violence that are rare in hunter-gatherer populations. Life expectancy actually decreased in many regions after the adoption of agriculture. Social inequality increased dramatically. Yet the transition was irreversible in most places. Once populations grew beyond a certain threshold, once ecosystems became too modified to support nomadic lifestyles, once social complexity reached a certain level, there was no going back. Human societies were locked into a trajectory that would eventually lead to cities, states, and the modern world. But those 90,000 years of nomadic existence weren't just a prelude to real history. They were the foundation that everything else was built on. The cognitive abilities, social skills, and cultural innovations that your ancestors developed during those millennia provided the raw material that agricultural societies would later reshape into civilization as we know it. Understanding this deep history changes how we think about human nature, about what we're capable of, about what we might become. Your ancestors proved that humans could create sophisticated, sustainable societies that lasted for thousands of years without destroying their environments or themselves. They showed that cooperation could be more powerful than competition, that knowledge could be more valuable than possessions, that human intelligence could solve problems we're still struggling with today. They lived through ice ages, volcanic winters, and ecological catastrophes that would challenge modern civilization, and they not only survived but created cultures of remarkable beauty and complexity. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that you carry their legacy in your genes, your instincts, your capacity for wonder and creativity. Those 90,000 years of human experience aren't lost. They're still with us, waiting to be rediscovered, waiting to teach us lessons we desperately need to learn about how to live sustainably, equitably, and meaningfully on this planet we all share. The story of those ancient ancestors isn't just history, it's possibility. It's proof that humans are capable of so much more than we often imagine. And perhaps, if we listen carefully to the echoes of that deep past, we might find the wisdom we need to navigate the challenges of our own rapidly changing world. The sophistication of these ancient societies becomes even more remarkable when we consider their approach to knowledge preservation and education. Your ancestors didn't have books, computers, or even written language, yet they developed educational systems that were in many ways superior to our own. Children in these societies didn't sit in classrooms memorizing facts they might never use. Instead, they learned through what anthropologists call legitimate peripheral participation. They started by observing adults at work, gradually taking on simple tasks, then progressively more complex responsibilities as their skills developed. A young person learning to make stone tools didn't just practice knapping rocks. They learned to read landscapes for the best stone sources, to understand the geological processes that created different types of raw materials, to predict how stones would fracture based on their internal structure. They developed an intuitive understanding of physics, chemistry, and geology that would take modern students years to acquire in formal education. But the learning went far deeper than technical skills. Every activity was embedded with cultural knowledge, social relationships, and spiritual meaning. Learning to hunt wasn't just about tracking animals and using weapons. It involved understanding complex ecological relationships, respecting the spiritual dimensions of taking life, maintaining reciprocal relationships with other hunters, and participating in elaborate social rituals that reinforced community bonds. This integrated approach to education created individuals who were incredibly well-rounded. Your ancestors couldn't afford to be specialists in the narrow sense we understand today. Everyone needed to know something about everything. A successful adult would need to be part naturalist, part engineer, part psychologist, part artist, part diplomat, and part spiritual practitioner. Yet within this broad competency, individuals did develop specialized expertise. Some became master trackers who could read animal sign like books, following trails that were invisible to others and predicting animal behavior with uncanny accuracy. Others specialized in plant knowledge, becoming living encyclopedias of botanical information who could identify hundreds of species and their uses. The most remarkable specialists were the long-distance travelers, individuals who specialized in maintaining connections between far-flung communities. These weren't just messengers or traders. They were living libraries of geographical and social knowledge, carrying in their memories detailed maps of vast territories and complex genealogies of distant peoples. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of these specialists could navigate across thousands of miles of unmarked terrain with extraordinary precision. They knew the locations of water sources, seasonal food resources, and safe camping spots along routes that might take months to complete. They could predict weather patterns, identify edible plants in unfamiliar territories, and communicate with people who spoke different languages. These navigational abilities weren't supernatural. They were the result of incredibly sophisticated observational skills and memory techniques that have largely been lost in the modern world. Your ancestors developed the ability to create detailed mental maps based on subtle environmental cues that most modern people would never notice. They could navigate by star patterns, wind directions, the behavior of birds, the growth patterns of plants, even the smell of distant water sources. They created mental databases of environmental information that were updated constantly as they traveled, allowing them to find their way across landscapes that changed dramatically with seasons, weather, and ecological cycles. But perhaps even more impressive was their social navigation abilities. These long-distance specialists had to remember complex networks of relationships, obligations, and protocols that governed interactions between different groups. They needed to know who could be trusted, who held grudges, which groups were allied and which were in conflict. They served as diplomats, mediators, and intelligence gatherers, maintaining the social networks that allowed prehistoric societies to cooperate on a continental scale. When conflicts arose between distant groups, these specialists often served as neutral parties who could negotiate resolutions. When resources became scarce in one region, they knew which communities might be willing to share and what would need to be offered in return. The seasonal gatherings where multiple communities would come together were orchestrated by these specialists. Archaeological sites across the world show evidence of massive temporary settlements, where hundreds or even thousands of people would congregate for trade, socializing, and cultural exchange. These weren't chaotic free-for-alls. They were carefully planned events that required months of preparation and coordination. Different groups had to be notified about timing and location. Conflicts had to be resolved in advance. Resources had to be allocated for feeding large numbers of people. Activities had to be organized that would strengthen social bonds and facilitate information exchange. The scale of some of these gatherings is breathtaking. Archaeological sites in Australia show evidence of meetings that brought together people from areas covering millions of square miles. In Europe, similar sites revealed trade fairs where goods from across the continent changed hands. In North America, gathering sites show evidence of cultural exchanges between groups separated by thousands of miles. These events weren't just social occasions. They were crucial mechanisms for maintaining genetic diversity, sharing technological innovations, coordinating responses to environmental changes, and preserving cultural knowledge. They were the institutions that held the prehistoric world together. At these great gatherings, your ancestors experienced something that might feel strangely familiar to you. The sense of being part of something bigger than yourself. Imagine it. For most of the year, your world is your immediate band. Maybe 30, 40 people at most. You know every face, every voice, every habit. You know who laughs too loudly, who sings to themselves while working, who always stands a little apart when the fire burns low. You know the way each person walks, the sound of their footsteps on dry ground, the shape of their shadow in morning light. Then the season turns. Signs begin to appear that only experienced eyes can read. Birds following certain routes, flowers blooming earlier or later than usual. The behavior of animals shifting in subtle ways, the wind changing direction and taste, the elders sitting a little more often in quiet thought, watching the sky and the horizon. Then one morning someone announces, in a tone everyone has been waiting for, that it is time to go. The band begins to move, not randomly, not wandering, but following a pattern woven through centuries of memory. You walk along routes worn smooth by your ancestors' feet, past rock faces marked with symbols that say, in a language older than writing, you are on the right path. Days pass. You meet other small bands walking in the same direction. At first it is a distant line of figures on the horizon. Then they are close enough to recognize faces, to raise hands, to call out names. Suddenly you're no longer 30 or 40 people, you are 80, then 100, then more. By the time you reach the gathering place, you are one stream among many that pour into a shared valley, a beach, a lake shore, a plateau beneath a familiar mountain. Hundreds of fires glow at night. The air hums with voices. Children run in groups so large that they look like flocks of birds, weaving through the adults, speaking in overlapping dialects that blend and blur. You see cousins you have not met since you were a child. You meet strangers who already know your name because stories about your band have travelled ahead of you. You recognize jewellery made from shells that only exist on a distant coast. You see tools knapped from stone that glitters differently from anything in your homeland. For a few weeks, the world expands. Food is abundant here because the timing of this gathering has been tuned carefully to seasonal peaks. Herds pass nearby, fish gather in massive numbers, plants ripen in great waves. But abundance alone wouldn't be enough to sustain these meetings. What really holds them together is meaning. There are rituals, some of them mark transitions, a child becoming an adolescent taking on the responsibilities of an adult, a couple joining their lives in a way that links not just two people, but two bands, two territories, two networks of obligation. Others are older, far older, tied to cycles of the sky and earth. A certain star rising just before dawn might signal the time to perform a ritual that has been enacted every year for as long as anyone can remember. The sequence of songs, gestures, and offerings is precise, but each generation adds small variations, tiny innovations that gradually weave through the tradition. During these gatherings, knowledge moves at a speed that would surprise you. A new way of hafting a spear point, discovered in some far-off valley, spreads as young toolmakers show it off to impressed peers. A new story about a great flood, told by a woman who has travelled from a distant river basin, makes listeners murmur, because it resembles their own flood stories more than coincidence should allow. A new melody catches on. A new dance step spreads through the night fires. A particular pattern carved on a bone or painted on skin becomes fashionable, travelling faster than any trade good. You can almost see ideas jump from mind to mind like sparks. For those listening to this as you drift towards sleep, it might be comforting to realise that this sense of gathering, of coming together in shared curiosity and wonder, is something you are reenacting right now. You're one person, in one place, at one time, but your mind is touching lives that ended tens of thousands of years ago. Their stories are still spreading. Their experiments with living are still unfolding in your thoughts. One of the most powerful things that happened at these gatherings was something you might not immediately think of: matchmaking. From the perspective of genes, of long-term population survival, these meetings were critical. Isolated groups risk inbreeding, which can lead to health problems and vulnerability to disease. So your ancestors developed intricate systems to prevent it. Elders carried in their heads genealogical maps as detailed as any modern database. They could look at two young people from different bands and with astonishing accuracy trace the threads of kinship that linked them. Decisions about who could marry whom weren't random. They were carefully managed to maintain genetic diversity while strengthening social alliances. But these weren't cold calculations. Imagine being a young person walking into one of these gatherings. All year long, your world has been familiar faces. Then, for the first time, you see someone your age from another band. They dress differently. Their accent is strange. Their mannerisms are fascinating. And before anyone has said anything, you feel something shift inside you. You wouldn't have called it chemistry. You wouldn't have had the modern words. But the experience would be the same. The songs sung at night by the fires weren't just for entertainment. They were also a way of displaying skills, personality, humour. The dances weren't just rituals. They were social theatre where people could observe each other, evaluate potential partners, look for hints of kindness, courage, intelligence. Sometimes matches were arranged. Sometimes they emerged gradually, as young people who had spent days on collective tasks found themselves drawing closer every evening, walking together for water, sitting near each other when stories were told, laughing at the same jokes. When two people decided to join their lives, it wasn't just about them. It was a bridge between networks, a fresh link connecting territories, knowledge, and mutual obligations. If you married into a distant band, you became a living messenger, carrying stories and information between two communities for the rest of your life. This, too, was a form of technology, not made of stone or bone, but of relationships. If you zoom in from these continental patterns down to the level of individual days, the rhythm of life in these societies becomes clearer. It was not constant struggle. It was not non-stop danger. It was a balanced dance between effort and rest, focused work and expansive leisure. A typical day didn't begin with an alarm clock. It began with light and temperature, with the slow brightening of the sky, with the shifting sounds of birds and insects. People woke gradually. Some tasks had to happen early. Fires needed tending. Embers coaxed back into flame. Water fetched before the heat rose. Children checked and reassured after dreams that clung to them like cobwebs. Groups split off according to the day's plans. A hunting party might leave while the stars were still faintly visible. A gathering group might wait for the dew to lift. Craftspeople might settle near good light, laying out tools that had been carefully stored the night before. For the smaller children, most of the day was play. But play, in these societies, was never just play. Children invented games that mimicked adult tasks, throwing stones at targets to imitate hunting, building miniature shelters out of branches and leaves, copying what they had seen their parents do, acting out social negotiations and conflicts, learning the subtle art of reading faces, voices, and body language. Anthropologists who study modern hunter-gatherer children often remark on their remarkable autonomy. From a very young age, they move through their environment with confidence, making decisions about where to go, what to do, who to join. Adults keep a watchful eye from a distance, intervening only when absolutely necessary. This approach to childhood likely stretches back deep into the Paleolithic. Your young ancestors were trusted not just with their own safety, but with the future of knowledge itself. When elders told stories, they weren't just passing time, they were seeding minds, knowing that some detail might lie dormant for years before suddenly becoming relevant in a crisis. Imagine a child hearing a story about a certain plant that only appears during a specific moon and can stop bleeding if applied quickly. Years later, as an adult, that story might surface when someone is injured, guiding their hand to the right plant in the right place at the right moment. This is how knowledge lived, embedded in memory, woven into narratives, carried inside people rather than outside them. If you try to imagine what it felt like to move through such a world, one difference might stand out. Silence. Not the silence of absence, but a living silence. Modern life surrounds you with constant noise, engines, electronics, notifications, background chatter. For your Paleolithic ancestors, there were no mechanical sounds, no hum of refrigerators, no distant traffic, no electrical buzz. The soundscape of their world was dominated by natural rhythms, wind through leaves, water flowing over stones, the calls of birds and animals, the murmur of human voices, the crackle of fire. In such an environment, subtle sounds mattered. The faint snap of a twig could mean an approaching predator, or a nervous animal about to bolt, or a child moving in their sleep. As a result, your ancestors listened in a way that is hard to fully recapture. They could hear distant thunder and read it as a set of probabilities about incoming weather. They could hear variations in birdsong and recognize the signatures of danger, opportunity, or seasonal change. They could walk through a forest and know, from sound alone, how recently other humans had passed by. This constant attention tuned their nervous systems differently. Modern people, overstimulated by artificial inputs, often struggle with anxiety, insomnia, and fragmented attention. Paleolithic people spent hours every day simply watching, listening, sensing. Not always in crisis mode, but in a state of relaxed alertness, a kind of quiet presence. If you're listening to this as you lie in the dark, that presence is something you can borrow from them. The way their attention flowed outward, gently but steadily, noticing small details without grasping at them, is not so different from what meditation teachers encourage today. Your breathing slowing, your awareness spreading into the room, into the night outside, into the faint hum of distant things. You are, in a sense, reconnecting with a mode of consciousness that kept your ancestors alive. Another dimension of their lives that rarely makes it into popular images is humour. We tend to imagine prehistory in solemn tones, grim hunters, stoic mothers, stooped elders. But if you think about the people you know today, you realize that human beings are irrepressibly funny. They tease, they play with words, they mock misfortune while comforting each other. They turn fear into stories that make everyone laugh around the fire. Your ancestors did the same. Archaeological evidence even hints at practical jokes, objects deliberately hidden in places where they would be found later. Carvings that exaggerate features in ways that scholars struggle to interpret, but which might simply be ancient cartoons. Songs and stories that include unexpected twists clearly designed to get a reaction. Humour was more than a luxury. It was a tool. It helped groups cope with fear. It diffused tensions before they turned into violence. It allowed people to criticize each other or point out dangerous behavior without causing open conflict. A well-timed joke was a social technology just as important as a well-napped spear point. And then there were their dreams. In a world without artificial light, sleep followed the deep rhythms of darkness. Nights were long. People didn't just collapse into bed exhausted and then drag themselves out at the sound of an alarm. Sleep likely came in phases, with periods of wakefulness in the middle of the night when people would sit quietly, talk in hushed tones, or simply stare into the embers and let their minds wander. Dreams in this context weren't random noise. They were experiences taken seriously, discussed in the morning, interpreted in the light of shared symbols and stories. If a hunter dreamed repeatedly of a particular animal, that might influence which prey was targeted in the following days. If someone dreamed of an ancestor giving advice, that advice might be considered alongside the counsel of living elders. In such societies, dreams were part of the decision-making matrix. The boundary between waking and dreaming was more porous. People entered altered states through drumming, dancing, fasting, or the careful use of psychoactive plants. They used these states to explore problems, heal trauma, and seek guidance. The night was not empty. It was full of encounters with the deeper layers of mind. You participating in a sleep story right now is not so far from this practice. You are letting your mind be guided into certain images and themes. You are allowing different perspectives on time, on your ancestors, on your own life. The line between story and dream is blurring just slightly, and in that blurring, space opens up for rest, for healing, for quiet reorientation. While all of this unfolded on land, another chapter of the Paleolithic story was being written on the water. From very early on, your ancestors were not just walkers. They were sailors and paddlers, navigators of rivers, lakes, and open seas. Evidence of this is simple but profound. Humans reached islands that have never been connected to the mainland by land bridges during the time of modern humans. That means boats, not accidental driftwood happenings, deliberate crossings, repeated enough times to establish thriving populations. Picture the first people who decided to push away from shore. They would have known water intimately. Rivers were highways long before roads. Lake shores were rich in resources. People learned to swim early, to wade and fish and play along the water's edge. But the idea of leaving land entirely, even for a short time, required a leap of imagination. Early watercraft were probably simple, logs lashed together, bundles of reeds, dug-out canoes carved with stone tools and smoothed with fire and sand. None of this was easy. Carving a canoe with stone axes and adzes could take weeks of labour. Every strike against the wood had to be precise. A mistake might ruin days of work. But when the canoe finally slid into the water, it transformed the world. Suddenly, routes that had taken days on foot could be traversed in hours. Rivers that had been barriers became routes. Lakes that had been edges became centres. New fishing grounds opened. New trade paths emerged. New myths formed about the creatures that lived in the depths and the spirits that ruled over currents and storms. Open sea crossings demanded even more skill. You had to watch the wind, read the waves, learn the moods of the ocean. You had to notice the flight paths of seabirds, the presence of driftwood, the smell of distant land that sometimes hangs faintly on the air. You had to build craft that could withstand not just the journey out, but the return. Imagine being on one of those early voyages. The shoreline grows smaller behind you. The land sounds fade. No more insects, no more crunch of leaves, only the slap of water, the creak of wood, the murmur of paddles. The sky and sea merge at the horizon. You feel the water breathe under the boat, lifting and lowering you in rhythms older than your species. At night, the stars appear with terrifying clarity. No streetlights, no haze, just an ocean of points of light stretching from horizon to horizon. In that vault, your ancestors found guides, certain stars rising and setting at predictable times, constellations moving along fixed paths, stories attached to each pattern, turning them into memory tools for navigation. Look up at the night sky where you are, if you can. Even if you only see a few stars through city light, know that those same stars watched over people paddling across unknown seas tens of thousands of years ago. They trusted their lives to patterns they had learned by watching patiently, night after night. Not all voyages ended well. Some boats capsized, some were blown off course, some never returned. But enough succeeded that, over centuries, humans spread to almost every habitable region on the planet. By the time agriculture began to appear in scattered pockets, your species had already mapped the world with footprints and wake lines. As their geographic range expanded, so did their catalogue of environments. Your ancestors learned to live in rainforests, where the air dripped with moisture, and plants layered themselves in dizzying tiers from forest floor to canopy. They learned to live in deserts, where water appeared only as faint mirages at noon, and real springs hid in narrow canyons. They lived on grasslands so vast that the horizon always shimmered, and in mountain valleys where winter wrapped the peaks in permanent ice. In each of these places they assembled a toolkit of knowledge, which plants could be eaten raw, which needed processing, which were deadly, which animals could be approached, and which must be treated with extreme caution, where water hid beneath dry surfaces, how to interpret the sky's subtle signals of approaching weather. The diversity of their lifestyles was extraordinary. Some groups followed large herds, timing their movements to the migrations of bison, reindeer, or other ungulates. Others focused primarily on rivers and coasts, building their year around fish runs, shellfish harvesting, and marine mammal hunting. Still others specialized in forest resources, nuts, fruits, tubers, small game. And yet, through all this variety, certain patterns remained consistent. The importance of shared knowledge, the centrality of social bonds, the daily practice of reading the world with all the senses. When you peel back the layers of technology, noise and speed that define modern life, what remains is a nervous system and a brain shaped by those older conditions. You're adapted to notice subtle changes, to learn by imitation and participation, to feel safest in small groups where you know every face, to move regularly, to alternate between effort and deep rest. Many of the anxieties and tensions of modern existence arise from asking this ancient system to operate in environments it was never designed for, sitting still indoors for long hours, processing abstract symbols on screens, navigating enormous anonymous crowds. Part of the quiet power of thinking about these 90,000 years is that it can help you forgive yourself If you struggle to focus all day, remember that your ancestors' attention was meant to ebb and flow, not lock onto a single task for 8 unbroken hours. If you feel restless, recall that their bodies covered miles each day at an easy, steady pace. If you feel lonely in the middle of a city, remember that they rarely lived among strangers. Their social world was made of familiar faces. None of this means you need to go back. You cannot. The world has changed too much. But it does mean that, in small ways, you can align your life more closely with the design principles written into your nervous system by those ancient days. A walk at dusk when the light softens and sounds grow sharper is not just exercise. It is an echo of the evening rounds your ancestors made, checking the perimeter, listening to the world settling into night. Sitting with someone you trust, without devices, simply talking and letting silence fall naturally between sentences, is not just pleasant. It is a return to the way humans have always processed experience, in company, through stories. Letting your mind drift as you fall asleep, wandering through images of long-ago fires, wide-open skies, and patient footsteps across ancient ground, is not mere fantasy. It is your mind moving along well-worn grooves laid down by lives that wrestled with many of the same questions you do. What does it mean to live well? How do we take care of each other? How do we face uncertainty without being crushed by fear? Your ancestors didn't answer these questions once and for all. They answered them anew every day, with each choice about where to walk, what to share, when to forgive, how to remember. If you listen closely enough, you can still hear them, not as distant primitive figures, but as fellow humans whose experiments in living still ripple through you. And there is more to see, more layers of their world to uncover, more quiet insights hidden in the long, unhurried days that stretched between the first stone tools and the first fields of grain, waiting just beyond the edge of this moment's light. If you move closer to those first fields of grain in your mind, if you imagine standing right at the threshold where nomadic life begins to blur into something more settled, you can feel a strange tension in the air. On one side is the deep past you've been travelling through, the long roaming centuries in which people followed herds, seasons and stories, rarely staying in one place for more than a few weeks or months. On the other side is the world you live in now, of permanent buildings, long-term property, fields cut into regular shapes, maps with fixed borders. There is a moment in between, a narrow, shimmering strip of time where humans are still mostly hunters and foragers, but some of them have started to experiment with staying put a little longer. They return to the same good spots each year, building sturdier shelters. They notice that certain plants reappear where seeds have fallen near camp. They begin to intervene at first almost casually, then more deliberately. You can picture one of these places. A river bends gently, slowing just enough to drop its load of fertile silt. The floodwaters recede each year, leaving behind a dark, rich band of soil along the banks. For generations, groups have camped here when the fish are running. They know every curve of the water, every sandbar that shifts a little with each season. At first, nothing is different. They arrive, they fish, they gather plants, they hunt animals that come to drink at dawn and dusk. They leave. But gradually someone notices that the plants near camp grow more thickly than those further away. Food scraps, ash, waste, everything tossed aside by human hands has changed the soil. Seeds from fruits and grains dropped casually have taken root. The next year, when they return, those plants are larger. Someone pays attention. They begin to connect cause and effect. What if, instead of just dropping seeds by accident, they do it on purpose? What if, as they leave, they scatter seeds in certain patches, Then notice what happens when they return. This is not yet farming in the way you think of it. No one is ploughing. No one is measuring rows. No one is spending long days bending over fields. But the first whispers of agriculture are there. An awareness that humans can nudge plant life, gently at first, then with increasing confidence. Within this experimental zone, daily life still feels very much like the world you've been exploring. People still move with the seasons. They still hunt, still gather, still travel to gatherings and trade fairs. But some camps begin to accumulate more permanent structures, storage pits lined with stone and clay, designed to keep seeds and dried foods safe from damp and pests. Hearths reused year after year. Shelter frames that are renewed instead of abandoned. In these half-settled places, something else changes too: the texture of memory. For a fully nomadic band, the land itself is the archive. When you walk past a certain rock, you remember a story associated with it. When you camp under a certain tree, you remember an argument that happened there years ago. The landscape is a living scroll, rich with markers and meaning. For people who begin to stay in one place longer, the archive starts to thicken. The same pit dug for storing nuts last year is opened again this year. The same path between river and camp is trodden deeper. The same fire pit holds layers of ash from a dozen winters. Children grow up seeing the same arrangement of shelters in the same clearing year after year. Time begins to layer vertically rather than horizontally. Instead of memories stretching out along long routes, they pile up in a single location. The ground beneath your feet becomes a stack of seasons, each one leaving its trace. When someone digs to repair a storage pit, they might uncover the bones of meals eaten by grandparents. When a post rots, the hole where it stood is still visible, a ghost of an older structure. If you close your eyes, you can imagine standing in such a place, feeling the weight of repeated lives pressing down through the soil. It feels different from the open, wide-ranging world of pure nomadism. There is a sense of accumulation of food, accumulation of tools, accumulation of stories, and then, inevitably, accumulation of conflict. Because once you start leaving things in one place, those things become worth defending. In earlier times, if a conflict arose between groups, there was always the possibility of moving away. If tension built within a band, families could split off, drift toward other groups, diffuse the pressure. But in semi-settled communities, roots, literal and metaphorical, begin to grow. If your ability to feed your children depends on the plants that grow in this particular patch of riverside soil, you cannot simply walk away. If your identity is tied to the burial place of your ancestors just beyond the camp, leaving becomes more complicated. If your group has invested thousands of hours into building specific structures, those structures gain a kind of gravitational pull. So your ancestors did something they'd been doing in other forms for a very long time. They invented culture to manage danger. In fully nomadic societies, culture helps people share, cooperate, avoid hoarding, and resolve disputes quickly enough that they do not threaten the group's mobility. In semi-settled societies, culture begins to develop new tools, more formalized rules about who can use which patches of land, more detailed rituals around inheritance, more explicit ways of marking where one group's territory ends and another's begins. You can picture simple forms of this. A line of stones along the edge of a field, a carved symbol on a tree, a particular pattern painted on a shelter that says, "This family has rights here." To you, living in a world carved into nations, provinces, and property lines, these gestures might seem modest. But for your ancestors, who had spent tens of thousands of years moving freely through landscapes shared by many bands, This was a profound psychological shift. It is the beginning of mine and yours as applied to land itself. And yet, even as these new patterns emerge, the older ways do not vanish instantly. For a very long time, both worlds coexist. In some regions, you would find groups living in fully nomadic patterns. In others, you would find semi-sedentary bands experimenting with plant management and storage. In still others, you would find a mix. People who farmed a little during part of the year, but then broke camp and moved like their ancestors for months at a time. If you had been born into that era, your life might cross all three modes. As a child, you might remember seasons of intense mobility, following game. As an adolescent, you might help tend patches of wild grain that your group encourages near camp. As an adult, you might travel to a gathering site and meet people from a fully mobile band that looks, to your eyes, like something from an older story. History in that moment is not a straight line. It is a braided river with channels that split and rejoin, carrying different ways of living side by side. When you zoom in again, down to the level of a single person, another dimension of these 90,000 years becomes clear: how your ancestors understood themselves. We often project modern individualism backward, imagining prehistoric people as solitary heroes battling nature. But the evidence suggests that identity was much more relational. If someone had asked a person from 40,000 years ago, "Who are you?" they would not have given answers like, "I am a hunter," or "I am an artist," in isolation. They would have described themselves in terms of relationships and roles. "I am the sister of the woman who knows the healing plants. I am the child of the man who walked to the far mountains and returned with stories. I belong to the people who follow the reindeer along this river." Identity was not a static label. It was a weaving of connections, to family, to band, to landscape, to ancestral stories, to the spirits believed to inhabit particular animals or places. You can see this relational identity most clearly in how they treated death. Across the Paleolithic, burial practices vary enormously, but a few themes recur. The dead are not simply discarded. Bodies are positioned with care, curled, extended, sometimes adorned with beads, ochre, or tools. In some cases, multiple bodies are buried together, arranged in ways that suggest specific relationships. In other cases, individuals are buried with objects that clearly had meaning in life: weapons, ornaments, items of clothing, even fragments of favorite tools. Imagine what it would feel like to participate in such a burial. You have known this person all your life. You gathered with them, hunted with them, shared food and stories and laughter. You have seen them angry, tired, elated, afraid, quiet. You have listened to their dreams. They have watched you grow. Now they are still. The group chooses a place, not randomly. Maybe a certain rise above the river. Maybe a cave that has been used for this purpose before. Maybe a specific tree under which others are buried. Everyone contributes something. Someone brings ochre, rich red, the color of blood and sunset. Someone brings beads strung on sinew that took weeks to make. Someone brings a tool the dead person made, a knife whose handle is worn smooth where their hand held it. Words are spoken, but not the kind you might expect. Instead of abstract concepts, people recall specific moments, that time they slipped and fell in the river and were pulled out by the person who now lies still. The day they discovered a new plant that saved a child's life. The night they told a story so funny that people still laugh when they think about it. Memories anchored in events, not in titles. As the body is covered with earth or stone, a sense of continuity is reaffirmed. The dead do not vanish. They move into a different mode of presence, as ancestors, as whispered names in stories, as dream visitors, as guiding figures in rituals. In a world without written records, this way of holding the dead is a form of archive too. Each burial place becomes a node in a network of meaning. When later generations pass by, they remember who lies there, and in remembering, they recall not just a person but an era. What animals were abundant then, what tools were used, what the climate was like. Over tens of thousands of years, climate is not stable. Your ancestors lived through changes so large that, if they happened within a single modern lifetime, they would be called apocalyptic. Glaciers advanced and retreated. Sea levels rose and fell by more than 100 meters. Coastlines moved inland or outward by miles. Grasslands became forests. Forests became deserts. Lakes appeared and dried up. From your vantage point now, it is easy to look at a map and forget that most of the coastlines you see are temporary. For much of the Paleolithic, human camps and settlements were located along shorelines that are now underwater, drowned as ice sheets melted and the seas crept higher. When you see a modern beach, know that beneath those waves, sometimes just a few meters down, there may be the ghosts of campsites, fire pits, stone tools, bones of meals, long since covered in sand and silt. For the people living through those changes, the world must have felt both deeply familiar and subtly unstable. Imagine growing up near a river delta where your grandparents tell you that when they were young the sea was further away. They point toward what is now open water and say, "We used to walk there. There were good shellfish beds. The sandbar where we played is gone." Or imagine living in a valley where each generation sees the glacier retreat a little further up the mountains. The white mass that once filled the horizon shrinks. New streams appear. Plants colonize freshly exposed soil. Your ancestors did not need global climate models to know that the world could shift. They saw it with their own eyes over the span of a single lifetime, and yet they adapted. They shifted hunting strategies, plant use, migration routes. They told new stories that wove these changes into their understanding of the world. They developed rituals to honor newly appearing features, a spring, a grove, a boulder uncovered by melting ice. When you think about modern climate anxiety, it can help to remember this. You are not the first humans to face a changing world. You're not the first to grapple with the feeling that something stable is slipping away. You carry the legacy of people who did not freeze in fear when rivers moved and forests changed. They observed, adjusted, and carried their knowledge forward. One of the most quietly impressive aspects of their adaptability was their ability to reimagine time. In purely survival-focused narratives, we assume prehistoric people thought in very short horizons. Where is today's food? Where will we sleep tonight? But the evidence suggests otherwise. When someone decided to carve a tiny figurine from ivory or stone, they were investing hours, sometimes days, into an object that had no obvious immediate survival function. When someone chose to teach a child a song that encoded the movements of stars across decades, they were thinking far beyond the present moment. Some groups built structures aligned with solstices and equinoxes, stone arrangements, post circles, oriented caves. These architectural choices turned the sky into a clock, allowing people to track not just days, but years and seasons with precision. Imagine standing in a clearing at dawn, watching as the first light of the sun pierces a gap between stones or posts. You've been told since childhood that this alignment marks a turning point, the day when the nights will begin to shorten or lengthen. You feel the weight of generations who have gathered here for the same purpose. In that moment, you are not just surviving, you are participating in a long-running project. making sense of time itself. All of this, the climate shifts, the rituals, the burials, the experiments with plants and settlements, unfolded during those 90,000 years that barely appear in most history books. The textbooks tend to start when city appear, when writing dresses speech in durable symbols, when rulers carve their names into stone. But for you here, resting and listening, those quieter centuries may be the most important, because they reveal something you might need to remember, that human life does not have to be organized around constant acceleration, constant accumulation, constant extraction. Your ancestors lived in a way that blended knowledge and humility. They knew an astonishing amount about their environments, yet they did not try to dominate them completely. They modified landscapes, but they left room for other species. They managed game populations, but they rarely hunted an area to collapse for generations on end, because they knew that their grandchildren would need those animals too. Their technologies were clever, but they remained embedded in stories that reminded people of limits. If a certain animal was considered a relative in myth, a teacher or a messenger, that story placed ethical boundaries around how and when it could be killed. If a particular hill was seen as the dwelling of powerful spirits, people might leave it untouched, even if it looked like a good place for a camp or field. You might not share those beliefs, but you can recognize the function they served. They were elegant psychological tools for balancing human desire with ecological reality. As you breathe slowly in the darkness, feeling your own chest rise and fall, you are already participating in one of the few practices that bridge your world and theirs. The simple act of stopping, of becoming still enough to notice that you are part of a larger web of life. Somewhere, right now, wind is moving through grass on a step where your distant ancestors once walked. Somewhere, right now, waves are breaking on a shore that did not exist when mammoths roamed. Somewhere, right now, someone else is lying in the dark, listening to a voice talk about deep time, feeling their own worries soften slightly in the face of this vast patient story. The thread that connects you to those ancient humans is not made of DNA alone. It is made of questions. What should we do? How do we take care of our children? What kind of person should I become? Where do we belong? Your ancestors answered those questions with song, with movement, with careful choices about where to walk, what to take, and what to leave. You answer them with different tools, but the questions themselves have not changed as much as you might think. If you could sit by one of their fires for a night, if you could listen to their talk once the day's practical tasks were done, you would hear familiar tones, jokes about someone's clumsiness or vanity, complaints about unfairness in food sharing, tenderness when a child wakes from a bad dream, worries about the weather, about the success of an upcoming hunt, about the health of an elder, speculation about strange lights in the sky, about odd behavior in animals, about unexplained dreams. Underneath different words, the emotional currents would be recognizably human. The person who fears they are not good enough, the person who feels responsible for others, the person who longs for something they cannot name, the person who carries an old grief that flares up unexpectedly. These currents run through you too. When you feel small in the face of your own problems, it can help to imagine that you're not standing alone in a bright, empty room of modernity. You're standing in a long line of people stretching back through the dark, each one holding some piece of the same burdens and the same capacities. Courage did not begin with written history. Patience did not begin with philosophy. Compassion did not begin with religion. All of these were practiced around simple fires, in simple shelters, by people who had to decide every day who they wanted to be in the face of hunger, weather, and uncertainty. The 90,000 years before civilization are sometimes described as a prelude, a warming up act before the main event. But when you lie quietly and let your attention settle into their world, they begin to feel less like before and more like another way. Another way to organize time, another way to understand wealth, another way to experience community, and another way to relate to the land beneath your feet. They are not a blueprint you can copy. Too much has changed. Population, technology, the scale of your impact on the planet. But their lives can act as a mirror, showing you aspects of yourself that modern life tends to blur or distort. The part of you that relaxes when you're near trees or water. The part of you that feels more alive after walking in open air. The part of you that sleeps more deeply after a day of simple physical tasks. The part of you that understands, without needing to be told, that relationships matter more than objects. These responses are not accidents. They are echoes of an older calibration, a set of expectations written into your nervous system by the long experiment of Paleolithic life. As you feel your body sinking further into whatever you're lying on, as your breathing finds a slower rhythm, you are not regressing. You're reconnecting with a tempo that sustained humans for tens of thousands of years. Those 90,000 years are not gone. They live in the shapes of your hands, in the way your eyes lock onto movement at the edge of your vision, in the way your ears perk at certain tones in a voice, in the sudden ease you feel when you stand around a fire with others at night. They live in your capacity to adapt, to learn, to share, and as you drift further towards sleep, you can imagine those long, uncounted generations not as a dark, blank space behind you, but as a vast, glowing plain of experience, quiet, enduring, patient, stretching back into the shadows, still offering you guidance in ways you may not even realize as the night deepens and the story continues beyond the edge of your waking thoughts. If you could travel through those 90,000 years like moving through rooms in a house, each door opening into a different time, you would start to notice something surprising. For all the variety of landscapes, animals, climates, and tools, there is a strange familiarity in the way humans move, speak, gather, and dream. The further you go back, the less it feels like visiting strangers, and the more it feels like visiting older versions of yourself. So imagine, just for a little while, that you can walk through 3 such rooms, 3 different days, 3 different parts of the world, all of them in that long, almost invisible era before civilization. The first door opens onto cold, the kind of cold that bites exposed skin in a few breaths, the kind of cold where sound moves differently, where the air feels sharp in your lungs. You step out onto an Ice Age steppe in what will someday be called Europe. The land is wide, open, almost treeless. Waves of golden grasses rimed with frost, low shrubs hugging the earth, distant bluffs where rock faces show streaks of red and black. In the far distance, a wall of white hints at the presence of ice sheets that claw down from the north, grinding mountains beneath them. Near you, a cluster of dwellings rises from the flat land. They're not caves, they're not flimsy tents, they're astonishing little feats of architecture, circular frames of mammoth bones and large wooden poles covered in hides and turf, arranged around central hearths. Some are connected by passageways, others stand alone. Around them you see pits dug into the ground, lined with stone, a refrigerator in reverse, using the cold earth to keep stored food from freezing and splitting. Smoke rises in pale streams into the sky, flattening and drifting sideways in the steady wind. Inside one of these shelters it is warm, thick furs line the floor. A woman sits cross-legged, scraping fat from a hide with practiced motions, the sound rhythmic and soft. A child, 3, maybe 4 years old, sits beside her, playing with a small piece of bone carved into the shape of an animal. Every now and then the child glances up at the woman's hands, watching what she does, eyes absorbing without effort the technique that will someday be needed. The woman looks up when a man enters, ducking through the low doorway. His cheeks are flushed from the cold. He shakes snow from his shoulders, steps carefully around the fire. He doesn't speak right away. He looks at the child first, touches the top of their head, then meets the woman's eyes. A brief exchange of gestures, a few low words, and you can feel it. The hunted herd they were tracking has moved, but not in the way they expected. The animals crossed a river too thinly frozen to support them. Some fell through, panicked, struggled. The ice shattered. The herd scattered. It could have been a disaster. But there's something else in his tone. There is also opportunity. Weak animals. Easy kills near the water's edge. Meat and fat gained with less risk than chasing a full, strong herd across the open plain. Plans begin to adjust. In the space of a few breaths, what looked like a setback becomes a new pattern of action. A different subset of hunters will go. The rest will focus on preserving what is already stored. Someone will go to check a line of snares near the bluff. Someone else will check the ice thickness on a nearby river bend to make sure children do not wander too close. Every decision is informed by layers of memory. What happened last time the river broke this way? What happened the year the snow came early? What happened the time the herd turned east instead of west? To you it might feel fragile, this life in the cold so dependent on animal movements and weather. But from the inside it feels stable, because stability is not the absence of change. It is the ability to respond. These people have everything they need to do that. Knowledge of terrain, knowledge of animals, knowledge of each other. At night after the hunt, the wind outside grows louder. Inside, the fire settles into a steady glow. People move closer together. Shadows climb the curved walls. Someone begins a story about a time when the ice itself seemed to crack with anger, and an avalanche roared down the slope. How everyone escaped, what they learned. The child with the carved bone animal is nodding off, their toy slipping from their fingers. When you look at them, you realize something simple and profound. If you could lift that child out of their time and place and raise them in your world, they would be as capable as anyone you know. They might feel a deep instinctive ease in wild spaces, but they could also learn to read, to use devices, to solve modern problems. Brains like yours have been around far longer than cities have. The second door takes you somewhere very different. Dry heat presses against your skin like a hand. The sky is a high, unbroken blue. The sun has a hardness to it, a white glare that flattens everything. You're in a desert landscape, perhaps in what will eventually become Central Australia, or another great arid region of the world. At first glance, the land looks empty. Not lifeless, but sparse. Scattered shrubs, wiry grasses, low bushes holding on to their moisture with tenacity. But when you begin to move with the people who live here, the emptiness dissolves. They walk with a rhythm that matches the land. Long, unhurried strides, a pace that conserves water and energy. No wasted movements. Every so often, someone veers slightly from the group, kneels, examines something. Maybe a plant, maybe tracks, maybe the texture of the soil at a certain point. They seem to be following invisible lines across the ground. Those lines are anything but random. They are song lines, mental maps encoded in stories and melodies that have been repeated for so many generations that they feel as solid as carved roads. If you could listen in, really listen, you would hear that each landmark has a story attached. That hill is where a particular ancestor rested. That rock is where a great lizard being is said to sleep beneath the surface. That dry riverbed is where a water spirit once travelled, leaving springs in its wake. To you, this might sound like myth in the modern sense, a fanciful tale. But in this context, myth is memory. Each story encodes position, direction, resource, warning. Sing the story, and you can walk the route. Walk the route, and you can find water that a stranger would miss, hidden in shaded crevices or beneath layers of sand. Walk the route, and you can reach a patch of tubers that are only edible if harvested and prepared in the right way, at the right time. Walk the route, and you can avoid areas where the land has been damaged, where resources need more time to recover. The group stops near what looks like a slight depression in the ground. To untrained eyes, it blends into the surroundings. To them, it is a known well. They dig briefly with hands and simple tools, pulling away dry sand, and eventually cool dampness appears. Water collects. They drink in careful order, children first, elders next. Then they rest, not just because of exhaustion, but because knowledge tells them that moving in the full blaze of midday sun is wasteful. They know how to wait. That art, waiting without agitation, resting without guilt, is something modern life rarely values. But for your ancestors, it was as practical as any tool. Pushing forward when the body needs shade would mean using water faster, increasing risk for no gain. So they pause. Some lie back and let their eyes half close. Some work quietly with their hands, mending a net or a sling. Some talk in low voices. Two young people exchange glances that hold a different kind of energy, a hint of the same currents you saw at the great gatherings. Attraction, curiosity, the first stirrings of a bond that might link families together. As the afternoon softens, the group rises and moves on, guided by knowledge that has traced these paths longer than any individual life. They may never build stone temples that last tens of thousands of years, but their primary monument is the continuity of their presence in this landscape. Generations upon generations, walking, singing, caring, adjusting. When modern researchers study oral traditions in such societies, they sometimes find that stories preserve sharp memories of events that happened many thousands of years ago. Volcanic eruptions, coastline changes, floods, wrapped in the language of spirits and ancestors. It is a reminder that memory can be longer and more precise than your culture usually assumes when lives are woven so tightly into place. The third door opens with the sound of waves. You step onto a shoreline in what will one day be called East Asia, or the Pacific Northwest, or another coastal region where land and sea blur through estuaries, inlets, and islands. The air smells of salt and living things. Gulls cry overhead. The tide is partway out, revealing slick rocks studded with barnacles, tide pools full of darting fish and slow-moving anemones. Kelp drifts in the shallows like dark ribbons. Here, your ancestors are boat people. A cluster of watercraft rests above the high tide line. Dugout canoes carved from massive logs, their hulls darkened and hardened by fire. Some are decorated with carved patterns or painted bands. Nets hang from poles to dry. Racks of fish and strips of seal meat smoke slowly near low fires. Life here moves in cycles tuned to the sea. Certain months of the year are dominated by particular runs of salmon or other fish. Other months focus on shellfish. Still others are dedicated to marine mammals or to plants that grow in the rich soils where rivers meet the ocean. Complex knowledge is required to manage all of this. Which bays are safe in which winds, how tide and moon interact. how to build fish weirs, stone or wooden structures that direct fish into traps without collapsing the surrounding ecosystem, when to leave a site alone to recover and when to return. You watch as a small group prepares to launch a canoe. They check the lashings that hold the side steady. They stow gear, nets, baskets, spears, wrapped parcels of dried food. Each person knows exactly where to sit, how to balance their weight. When they push off, the boat moves smoothly, cutting across the ripples with a confidence that only comes from long practice. Out on the water, they are quiet, not silent in a forced way, but attentive. Someone points out a pattern of ripples that suggests a shoal of fish. Someone notices the direction of a swell coming from beyond the visible horizon, evidence of a distant storm. Someone else tracks the position of the sun, the shapes of clouds, the flight paths of seabirds. They are not thinking in separate categories. Now I am doing navigation, now I am doing weather. It is all one continuous flow of perception, decision, action, adjustment. On a far rock you see something that looks small now, but will be large later. Carved symbols, simple lines and shapes repeated in specific combinations. They might mark a clan, a good fishing spot, a danger zone. To an outsider they look like art. To the people who carved them, they are part of a communication system extended into the environment. By the time all of these scenes are unfolding, the cold plains, the desert songlines, the coastal canoes, tens of thousands of years of human experience have already accumulated behind them. Tens of thousands of years of experiments in how to live. Not abstract experiments carried out in laboratories, but real ones on real landscapes, with real consequences. If a hunting strategy fails, people go hungry. If a plant is misidentified, someone becomes sick. If a social custom proves destructive, groups fracture or fade. The practices that persisted through those 90,000 years did so because they worked, for the people who used them, and often for the ecosystems they inhabited. When you look at the world now, with its dense cities, its global communications, its vast economic systems, it can be tempting to think that the Paleolithic has nothing left to teach you, that it is, at best, a curiosity. A distant prologue. But if you strip away the surface differences, there is a deeper common project tying you to them, the project of turning experience into wisdom. Your ancestors' version of that project did not involve writing books or building universities, but it was no less serious. Each generation tried to pass forward what it had learned. Which patterns lead to flourishing and which to collapse? Which ways of being strengthen communities and which tear them apart? Sometimes they succeeded brilliantly, sometimes they failed, sometimes entire lineages of knowledge vanished when a group was wiped out by disease, disaster, or conflict. Sometimes brilliant insights never spread beyond a small region. Sometimes a damaging practice persisted for generations before its cost became undeniable. The same is true today. For every useful idea that travels quickly across the globe, there are quiet truths that remain local. For every harmful pattern that gets questioned and dismantled, there are others that continue unchecked. When you view your own time through this lens, just one more chapter in a very long experiment, it does not make your problems trivial, but it does make them more comprehensible. You're not uniquely broken. You're not uniquely doomed. You're inhabiting a complex, high-speed iteration of something humans have been doing since those first small bands walked out of Africa, trying to build lives that balance individual needs with collective survival, present comfort with future stability, curiosity with caution. The reason it feels difficult is because it has always been difficult. The reason it occasionally feels beautiful, when you're with people you trust, or walking under an open sky, or absorbed in meaningful work, is because those are the conditions your nervous system recognizes as right. In the last stretch of those 90,000 years, something like a pivot begins. Certain regions, fertile river valleys, mild climates, areas with abundant wild grains, see an increase in plant management. People build more permanent homes, they store more food, populations grow. With each increment of growth, knock-on effects ripple outward. More people in one place means waste must be managed differently. Diseases that could not sustain themselves in small scattered groups now find enough host to spread. Systems of authority shift, sometimes becoming more formal, sometimes more rigid. Inequalities in status and resource access deepen. Your ancestors were not naive, they noticed. They noticed that some of the new patterns brought undeniable benefits, more predictable food supplies, more specialized crafts, larger ritual gatherings, complex arts. They also noticed that some of the old benefits were slipping. Freedom to move away from conflict, more balanced workloads, closer contact with wild landscapes. Different groups weighed these trade-offs differently. Some doubled down on farming and settlement, channeling more and more energy into increasing yields, building infrastructure, defending territory. These are the ancestors who built the first cities, who left behind ruins and monuments that still stand. Others kept one foot in the older world. They might farm part of the year and hunt part of the year. They might maintain strong ties with fully nomadic relatives. They might build small, flexible villages rather than massive, immovable ones. Still others looked at farming and simply said, no. They stayed nomadic, or semi-nomadic, well into the age of empires, preserving ways of life that predated grain fields by tens of thousands of years. If you listen closely, you can feel an echo of these choices in your own life. Every time you consider whether to work more hours to earn more money, knowing it will cost you time with people you care about. Every time you decide whether to stare at a screen a bit longer or step outside for a walk. Every time you feel the pull toward accumulating more things and the counterpull toward simplifying. These are modern variations of ancient trade-offs. Stability versus mobility, accumulation versus portability, specialization versus versatility. The fact that you feel torn sometimes does not mean you are failing. It means you are human. When the first cities finally rise, mud brick walls along rivers, terraces of stone on hillsides, clusters of houses pressed close together, something subtle happens to the story your species tells about itself. Time before cities begins to fade in importance. The people who write, who inscribe symbols into clay or carve them into stone, are, almost by definition, members of the new settled world. Their concerns dominate the record, their triumphs, their wars, their gods, their dynasties. The long wandering age before all that becomes mythologized or dismissed. Gradually, the idea takes hold that real history starts with writing, with kings, with borders. But your body did not get that memo. Your nervous system still carries tuning parameters calibrated in the long darkness before neon and concrete. Your stress responses still fire in ways appropriate to small group living, not global news feeds. Your sense of meaning still responds most strongly to direct relationships and tangible contributions, not abstract metrics. This is not a defect to be overcome. It is a starting point to be understood. As you lie there now, perhaps beginning to yawn more often, perhaps feeling the muscles around your eyes grow heavier, you are inhabiting a space your ancestors knew very well. The threshold between waking and sleep, between one kind of knowing and another. They too lay in darkness listening to voices of parents, elders, shamans, tell stories that were designed not just to inform, but to guide the mind gently toward that other mode of processing where dreams can rearrange experience in ways waking thought cannot. A story like this one, drifting between description and reflection, between concrete scenes and gentle suggestion, is a modern heir to that tradition. It is not trying to persuade you of a doctrine, it is inviting you into a different relationship with your own mind. To see that the worries crowding your thoughts are one layer of reality, but not the only one, that beneath them runs a deeper current of inherited strength, adaptability, and potential. The people who survived those 90,000 years did not do so by being perfect. They made mistakes. They overhunted sometimes. They misread the weather sometimes. They quarreled and hurt each other sometimes. But across thousands of generations they kept finding ways to repair, adjust, and move forward. They learned how to apologize without using that exact word. They learned how to share even when they were afraid. They learned how to lighten heavy moods with humor. They learned how to sit quietly and let grief move through them without drowning. You carry those capacities too. You may live in an apartment rather than a mammoth bone house. You may cross oceans in hours instead of weeks. You may work with data instead of hides or stone. But at the level of heartbeat and breath, at the level of eyes that seek faces and hands that reach for others, you are built from the same materials. If you listen within, very gently, you might even sense that your own instincts sometimes know things your conscious mind has not fully articulated. A feeling that a certain relationship is safe even before you could explain why. A sense that a certain environment drains you, even though it looks fine on paper. A pull towards certain places, forest, shore, open field, that calm you quicker than any technique. Those instincts are not random. They are whispers from systems that has been learning for a very long time. As you move toward the end of this journey, the details of those ancient lives may begin to blur in your mind. Names fall away. Dates lose sharpness. What remains is a feeling. The feeling of fires reflected in eyes. The feeling of feet on earth. The feeling of voices in the dark telling you that you belong to a story much larger than your individual life. If you've been listening to this while trying to fall asleep, you do not need to remember every fact, every scene. What matters is that a part of you has relaxed into that larger story. You have shifted, even slightly, from seeing yourself as a lone mind floating in a complicated, chaotic world, to seeing yourself as a continuation of something very old and very resilient. There is a strange kind of comfort in that. The deadlines, messages, responsibilities, and decisions of your daily life are real. They matter. But they are not the only reality. Beneath them runs a quieter one, the steady rhythm of breath that connects you to every ancestor who ever lived long enough to sleep. So as we come to a gentle close, you might imagine one last scene. Not a specific time or place, but a composite. A fire burning low, people around it, some sitting upright, some already half asleep, heads resting on folded arms or against one another's shoulders. Sparks drift upward, blending with the stars. The air carries the faint mixed smells of smoke, earth, bodies, and night plants. Someone is still speaking, their voice softer now, more like a murmur than a performance. Their words have become less distinct, more rhythmic. The content matters less than the tone. Children's eyes droop, an elder's jaw slackens in sleep. The fire doesn't demand anything from them. It just offers warmth and light, a small circle of safety in a vast, dark world. You're lying in your own version of that circle now. Your walls may be made of painted plaster instead of hides. Your roof may be tile instead of thatch or bone. The glow you see might come from a screen rather than coals, but the function is the same, a bubble of shelter in which it is finally safe to let go, safe to set down for a while the need to plan, to solve, to anticipate, safe to say, in the quiet of your own mind, for this moment, it is enough. Enough that you have reached this point in your day. Enough that your heart has continued beating through everything that has happened to you so far. Enough that hundreds of thousands of years of human experimentation have delivered you to this exact breath, in this exact body, with this exact capacity to rest. The world will still be there when you wake up. Challenges will still exist. Decisions will still need to be made. But for now, you can remember that even during the harshest winters, even in the most uncertain migrations, even when climates were shifting and herds were moving and seas were rising, your ancestors still lay down each night, closed their eyes, and surrendered to sleep. They trusted that their bodies knew what to do in that darkness. They trusted that the knowledge they had stored during the day would be sifted and sorted in dreams. They trusted that, more often than not, they would wake to another morning with enough light, enough food, enough company to continue. You can borrow that trust as your breathing settles into a slow, regular rhythm, as your muscles soften one by one, as your thoughts stretch out thin and quiet, like smoke rising and fading into the sky. You have walked, in imagination, through 90,000 years that rarely make it into the story your culture tells about itself. You have seen that those years were not empty. They were full of ingenuity, resilience, creativity, and care. Those qualities did not vanish when agriculture appeared or when cities rose. They are still available to you, not as distant, idealized traits, but as practical resources woven into your nervous system. So now, at the end of this long, slow journey backward, you can turn gently toward the only direction that truly exists. Forward. Not forward in the sense of frantic progress, but forward in the sense of the next breath, the next moment of rest, the next small decision to be kinder to yourself, to align your days a little more closely with what your deeper self knows you need. Your ancestors walked through ice ages and deserts, across mountains and oceans, through storms and droughts and endless unknowns, to deliver their experience into you. Let that be enough for tonight. You do not need to solve everything. You do not need to fix all of history. You only need to sleep. So let your eyes close if they have not already. Let your breathing deepen. Imagine the embers of a long ago fire settling into a soft, warm glow. Imagine the night wrapping gently around you, as it did around them. And as you drift, know that you are not falling into emptiness, but into a deep, old river of human rest that has carried countless lives before yours, and will carry countless more after, always returning, always renewing, as the long, quiet ages before civilization fold themselves softly around your dreams.